This is the smell of the leftover tuna fish sandwich you left in your lunchbox over the weekend in a wimpy trash bag.
Wimpy, wimpy, wimpy!
Blech! And this is the smell of that same sandwich in a hefty, ultra-strong trash bag.
Hefty, hefty, hefty!
Ah, smell the difference? Hefty Ultra Strong has Arm & Hammer with continuous odor control, so no matter what's inside your trash, you can stay one step ahead of stinky. And for bigger jobs, try the superior strength of Hefty Large Black Bags.
Hi, this is Ray, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Did Not Know But Should. In this episode, we continue our look at the election of 2000. So without further ado, let's join the discussion already in progress.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of this podcast, is that we always gather together and come at it from many different perspectives. Just, you know, as you mentioned, where were we? What were we doing? And how has it impacted us? But also our love for different areas. You're a big fan of presidential history, and you loved discussing the inside outside scope of presidents and kind of, you know, how they lead both domestic and foreign, and I'm really big with the Supreme Court, and I like to defend the Supreme Court, and, you know, and I think you said something earlier that talks about there has to be a time when you let go, right? You got to stop, you just got to, but Bush v. Gore kind of paved the way so that you don't stop.
Yeah.
Because for the first time, really, you're allowing a court to have a lot of say in what's about to happen.
There's a really important issue there as far as the constitutional framework for how a disputed election should be resolved. Because in the Constitution, both in Article 2 and I believe in the 12th Amendment as well, it is the House of Representatives. If nobody reaches that 270 or majority, whatever the majority is in the given election, if nobody reaches that point, it goes to the House, and the House votes, each state getting a single vote for the president. And that has happened before in American history. In 1876, it didn't do that. There was a special committee appointed. And, of course, they ended up giving the election to Rutherford B. Hayes. But
which was shady, by the way, also,
yeah,
and how that vote switched hands also.
Yeah.
That was some shady dealings.
And, you know, Tilden always believed that election was stolen from him, and it may very well have been.
Right. And you know, even in the 2020 election, there was the thought that it might go to the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
But
And the question is, would it have been better to go to the House and let that process play out, which Bush would have won anyway, or would it have been better to let the Supreme Court handle it, like they did?
And so you have two ways of looking at that. First of all, Congress is in itself political. Yeah. There's just no other way of doing that. The Supreme Court is designed to be non-political, but it is. I mean, it's a hidden. I guess it's one of those things that you know but you don't know, right? But it's true. It is political. But if you look at it going through Congress, which I understand, but you wouldn't have handled the legal issues. And what the legal issues are, this idea of, you know, when do you have to stop something? When do you have to keep going? Because, once again, go back to the Constitution, you know, there is a big difference about federalism, that you have to allow the states to be able to operate as states, and the federal government just can't walk into Florida and tell Florida what to do or how to do it.
I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand when we talk about presidential elections, and I think we saw that in 2020, is there was this idea that the federal government or there was some national election system, and it's not. Each state has their own election laws. Each state has their own rules. Sometimes those rules make sense. Sometimes those rules don't make sense. And you know, when you look at the Constitution, what it requires of the states is actually, you know, it talks about who must be allowed to vote.
Right.
But as far as how a state determines who gets its electoral votes, that's up to the states.
Yeah, and once again, there is precedent about how states have had some issues as far as who is, I mean, because you are technically, as a state, required, if it turns out, let's just use Bush and Gore since we are, but like if Tennessee voted for Gore, you have to give the votes to Gore. But there are some people who try to
faithless electors,
which is a whole fun podcast that we should probably talk about, just recent stuff.
The thing about faithless electors is that, there's something everybody's scared of.
Right.
Oh gosh, there's going to be a faithless elector or a whole string of them, and it's going to turn. Never in American history has an election been turned by a faithless elector.
No, and it can't be.
You have to have a whole bunch of them,
right.
and the way the Electoral College works today is in each state. For most states, not all states, most states, Electoral College are winner take all. There's like 2 maybe that aren't.
I think so.
But you have basically a Democrat slate of electors and a Republican slate of electors, and if the Republican candidate wins that state, those electors are the ones that are going to be seated.
Yeah.
So the chances of a faithless elector turning the election, very low.
Yeah, I think it's Maine and Nebraska or something like that. It's not many.
I think Maine is one of them.
But if you go back and think about what you were saying, everybody's talking about we need uniformed national election laws. Thinking about voter ID and you think about even curbside voting and how you can't say that the way that you vote in Hawaii is going to be the same way that you vote in North Carolina, because you take away one of the key ingredients of America, which is the allowance for states to do what is in the best interest of their particular state. And we have to be careful that when we're talking about all of these changes that should be made, but a lot of times they need to be made by individual states and not by a united form of government.
And one thing I'm often concerned about is the sort of patchwork approach. State by state, we're going to try. I know recently there was talk about states saying that they were going to give their electoral college votes to the winner of the national popular vote, and that sounds real good until your state votes for candidate Y and candidate X wins. And then you give your electoral college votes to Y, even though X won your state.
Right.
So and then nobody's going to be happy.
Yeah.
So I think changes to the system need to be done, and I know this is not a popular idea because it's a difficult thing to do, and it was meant to be difficult. Changes to the national system need to be done by constitutional amendments. Not by a patchwork approach. Each state has its own laws, its own rules, but as far as the Electoral College is concerned on a national basis, I think that needs to be done through constitutional amendments and not a patchwork approach.
But one of the things, and we'll end this topic and go to his concession and how that relates, but it all goes back to equal protection.
Yes. That
equal protection clause, if you're not familiar with it, please look at 14th Amendment, because it is so important. And people, equate the 13th, 14th, 15th as, end of Civil War, Reconstruction. But there's so much for individuals today, as far as what your rights are. And I think that if we take anything from the Bush v. Gore as far as the voting aspect, it's that everyone that is a citizen of the United States is entitled to cast a vote. Fair, legal, but is entitled to cast that vote. Yeah. And it matters.
It does matter. It absolutely matters.
Because one vote, you mentioned Samuel Tilden, one vote. I mean, I know that was the committee, but one vote. But look at how many votes in history by one person.
Well, George W. Bush in Florida, less 600 votes. You determined who the President of the United States is. And, Al Gore, December 14, 2000. I almost said 2020. 2000. And I wonder, just this is really off the top of my head, Chris, I wonder if people had known what was coming in 2001, if the results would have been the same. If people had that crystal ball, well, 9/11 is going to happen. Who do you want in the White House on 9/11? I don't know the answer to that. It's very interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, but and I think I'll be very careful how I say this, but George Bush did exemplify leadership in the very beginnings of the first days after 9/11.
Yes.
You can have all the discussions you want as far as what happens later on in foreign and in Iraq and weapons of all that stuff is for debate. But the visual image of him standing on that pile of rubble, and with those firefighters, and Ray, I mean, this is not something that I looked up or anything, but I still remember that image, and I still remember him standing there with the flag and with the firefighters, and I think that he said something like, "We hear you, the country hears you, the world will hear you." Something.
And the people who knock down these buildings are going to hear from all of us.
Yes, I mean, but that's not a scripted moment.
No,
that's not something that is planned, and I'll just be honest. I don't think Al Gore pulls that off.
I agree.
I just don't think he could. Just because of what you said earlier, he just didn't have that emotional ability, because Al Gore, I mean, for who he is and what he is, he just didn't convey that person of great emotion.
And Bush did. I mean, I remember seeing a phone, several things. Number one, that scene there at Ground Zero, but also I remember seeing a video, and this was at the time, so it's been 20 years since I've seen this, but a video of Bush in the Oval Office on the phone, and he's very emotional. The speech Bush gave in the Joint House of Congress, very, very emotional. I mean, usually when you think about a joint house, the State of the Union, if you got a Republican president, the Democrats hardly stand up and clap. But that night, everybody was standing up and clapping constantly. And I think Bush was able to harness that emotion.
He was able to harness that emotion because of the emotion that he was able to carry into that. But Ray, as you, I think, alluded to earlier about surrogates, he had a really good team.
Yeah.
He had, I mean, as much as the delivery of that speech, that was very important, the delivery, but also the people that wrote that speech.
Yeah. He had very good people around him.
He had good people around him. I mean, even today, I mean, we won't, you think about a Condoleezza Rice or a Colin Powell or somebody like that who, regardless of your political affiliation, you have a lot of respect for their leadership and for what they did. And I just don't know if Al Gore would have been able to have had those type of people around him to carry America through the early stages of 9/11. Everything else later on is something to be discussed later, but at that moment, to be able to handle that moment of crisis. So it's a great conversation that you ask with that, and maybe it's not an issue because more people, Bush wins the popular vote. If you had the crystal ball, like you said, Bush wins the popular vote, Bush wins the electoral vote, runs away. It's not even an issue, maybe.
And getting to the concession speech, it's interesting. I saw a poll that 80% of Americans in 2000 accepted the outcome of the election.
80% in 2000
accepted the outcome, despite it being disputed. That's just one poll.
So this was after December, right? So this was after everything had been done, after the courts and all that. 80% said, boom, we accept
the outcome. And I think a large part of that, Chris and listeners, was the way Al Gore conceded. I think that had on December 14. I think his speech, and I've got it here in front of me, and I'll be quoting parts of it, but I think his speech really laid the groundwork for the American people to, by and large, maybe not like the outcome, but accept the outcome. Because he said, and I do want to quote him, he says, quote, "Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity, for the sake of our unity of the people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession," end quote. And I think that in this speech, if you go through it, it's not long. But I think that kind of statement is probably what allowed for such a large number of Americans to at least not like the outcome, but be willing to accept it.
So Al Gore is not remembered for many things.
No.
But one thing he will always be remembered for is he actually unified the country in that speech.
He tried to. He tried to hold his head up and depart in a dignified way. And I think he could walk away with a consolation prize. I won the popular vote.
Right.
And probably in the back of his mind, I really won this election. In the back of his mind somewhere. Now, he didn't say that, but I'm sure somewhere in the back of his mind, that was part of his, what do you call it? Second place finish type.
Yeah, I mean, but I think, there's a lot to be said about Al Gore and the way that he walked off the scene, because honestly, that's when he walked off the scene. I mean, he's been an advocate for climate and for some other things, environmental, but
yeah, he didn't really come back until, what was it, 2003, 2004 with the war in Iraq. Then he sort of reemerged.
But it wasn't a big emergence. I mean, he wasn't.
He gave some very
huge
hot speeches, but I mean, he didn't become a shadow president or anything like that. And as we come off of the heels of the 2020 election and January 6th and all that, he does say something in here that I think is very interesting in light of that. Quote, "This has been an extraordinary election, but in one of God's unforeseen paths, this belatedly broken impasse can point us all to a new common ground, for its very closeness can serve to remind us that we are one people with a shared history and a shared destiny. Indeed, that history gives us many examples of contests as hotly debated, as fiercely fought, with their own challenges to the popular will. Other disputes have dragged on for weeks before reaching resolution, and each time, both the victor and the vanquished have accepted the results peacefully and in the spirit of reconciliation. So let it be with us," end quote.
Wow, that's really powerful. And Ray, I'm thinking here. Many years ago, there was a president by the name of John Kennedy. John Kennedy was an author. He wrote a book that was called Profiles in Courage. Profiles in Courage, speaks of people in American history. Of course, this was before his untimely death, but right. He spoke of people in the past who really made a difference in unifying the country. And Ray, I just can't help but think that both of these individuals have had a major impact in our society. You have George Bush. We know that as president, he did some really good things to help keep the nation together. And I think if there was an updated edition, you would have to put George W. Bush in there as far as being a unifier and a profile in courage for the way that he handled immediately following 9/11. Yeah. But I also think that Al Gore is one of those lesser-known heroes in profiles of courage, because he could have fought, he could have whined, he could have complained, and he could even today say, I won, I won, I won.
You think about this. Let's not forget this. He is Vice President of the United States. He is the one that by federal law on January 6th, unless it falls on a Sunday, he is the one that would have to go up in the Senate chamber
and
certify this election. And he did it. And he did it fairly. And he didn't try to overturn anything. He didn't threaten to do anything. He did exactly what the Constitution and federal law called him to do.
Yeah, and this is nowhere near comparison to anything that happened in 2020 or whatever. I think it's just the focus must be on when people are willing to demonstrate humility, and service and loyalty to country over their own desires and wants, you truly become a profile in courage. And regardless of your political beliefs, your political affiliations, regardless if you think he was a great vice president or if he was a terrible vice president, regardless of what you think about Al Gore, it took a lot of gumption to stand up in front of the nation and say, let's move on.
Yeah, and he did. Again, I want to quote more from Al Gore. He says, quote, "As for the battle that ends tonight, I do believe, as my father once said, that no matter how hard the loss, defeat might serve as well as victory to shape the soul and let the glory out." I'm going to skip a ways down here. And he says, "Now the political struggle is over and we turn again to the unending struggle for the common good of all Americans and for those multitudes around the world who look to us for leadership in the cause of freedom." End quote. I mean, yeah, definitely profiling courage.
Wow, what a wonderful podcast for us to be able to share. I've really enjoyed just having this conversation and just reflecting back and also seeing some lessons that we can learn. And I think the lessons that I take away from our podcast today is, number one, that we must ensure that all individuals have that equal protection, that they have that right to freely and fairly cast their vote, but also that if our nation is going to continue to grow and to be a nation that is looked upon with reverence and with fascination, we must be people of humility. And we need to work together to support those that even when we lose, that we always try to find a way to win. And regardless of what you think about Al Gore, he might have lost 2,000, but he won in the eyes of a lot of people.
Yeah, he definitely stepped up to the plate there. Well, I hope everybody's enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. Please feel free to look us up on Facebook. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Stitcher, Google Podcast, Sounder FM. We're on Spotify. Share this podcast with your friends and family. Share it on social media. If you'd like to contact us, you can always contact us with suggestions, with complaints, or whatever you want to contact us with. Feel free to do so. Our email is historyyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter U, should know @gmail.com. And as usual, until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk at you later.
This is the smell of the leftover tuna fish sandwich you left in your lunchbox over the weekend in a wimpy trash bag.
Wimpy, wimpy, wimpy!
Blech! And this is the smell of that same sandwich in a hefty, ultra-strong trash bag.
Hefty, hefty, hefty!
Ah, smell the difference? Hefty Ultra Strong has Arm & Hammer with continuous odor control, so no matter what's inside your trash, you can stay one step ahead of stinky. And for bigger jobs, try the superior strength of Hefty Large Black Bags.